In the sun-scorched plains of Texas, where legends are born in blood and bullets, a deadly mistake is about to unfold. When the notorious Carson gang rides into Broken Spoke Ranch, they see nothing but fresh meat. A young ranch hand who can barely hold his rope, let alone a gun. For them, he's just another mark to break, another story to tell over whiskey. They don't notice how his eyes track their every move, how his hands rest too naturally near his worn holster, or how the ranch horses fall quiet when he walks past. What they see is a boy playing cowboy. What they don't see is the ghost of Jake Thunder McKenna, the most feared gunslinger the West has ever known, living in his son's eyes. The gang's about to learn the hard way that some legacies don't die, they just wait for the right moment to strike. This is the story of how 7 hardened outlaws discovered that sometimes the deadliest snake is the one you mistake for a worm. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the Texas sky in shades of amber and gold as Daniel McKenna worked the fence line at Broken Spoke Ranch. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, though he'd only been at the ranch for 3 months. Sweat trickled down his neck, darkening the collar of his simple cotton shirt as the morning sun climbed higher. The young man kept his head down, just as he always did, avoiding the curious glances from the other ranch hands. Martha Stewart, the ranch's owner, watched from the wraparound porch of the main house, her keen eyes noting how the horses settled whenever Daniel passed near their corrals. 25 years of running the ranch had taught her to read people as well as she could read weather patterns, and something about this quiet young man stirred memories she couldn't quite place. The sound of hammering paused as Hank, the foreman, approached Daniel. "Got a wild one in the breaking pen," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Think you can handle it, boy?" The challenge in his voice was clear. They'd all seen Daniel fumble simple tasks, drop tools, seem uncertain around the basic work of ranching. It had become something of a morning ritual, testing the new hand's resolve. Daniel kept his eyes lowered, nodding slightly. "I'll give it my best, Mr. Hank." His voice was soft, almost apologetic, but his fingers twitched ever so slightly at his side, a tell nobody noticed. The breaking pen drew a small crowd of ranch hands, all eager to see the new guy get thrown. The horse was a magnificent Mustang, coal black with a white star on its forehead, its eyes rolling wild as it paced the pen. Daniel climbed the fence with seemingly awkward movements, but anyone watching closely might have noticed how he landed. Without a sound, what happened next would be talked about in whispers for weeks to come. Daniel approached the horse with slow, measured steps, his body language changing subtly. Gone was the clumsy ranch hand. Something in the way he moved reminded Martha of a mountain lion she'd once seen stalking through her property. The horse snorted, pawing the ground, but Daniel never broke stride. He spoke to the Mustang in low tones that didn't carry to the watching crowd. His hands remained loose at his sides, no rope, no tools, just man and horse. The Mustang's ears flicked, forward, then back, its powerful body coiled for flight or fight. Then Daniel did something that made Martha's breath catch. He turned his back on the wild horse. The crowd muttered, someone laughed, but Martha found herself gripping the fence post tight enough to whiten her knuckles. The Mustang took 3, threatening steps forward, nostrils flaring. Daniel remained still, his back presented to 2,000 pounds of untamed power. The horse moved closer, close enough that its breath stirred Daniel's collar. Then, with a grace that seemed to defy his previous awkwardness, Daniel turned. His hand came up not to grab or control, but to rest gently on the Mustang's nose. The horse went still, and in that moment Martha saw something in Daniel's stance that sent a shiver down her spine. The echo of a man she'd known long ago, a man whose very presence could command respect from man and beast alike. The other, Hands fell silent as Daniel swung himself onto the Mustang's bare back. There was no bucking, no fight, just a moment of perfect understanding between rider and mount. As they moved around the pen together, Martha noticed how Daniel's right hand rested naturally at his hip where a gun might sit. It was an old gunfighter's habit, one she hadn't seen in many years. Later that evening, as the sun painted the sky in deeper shades of red, Martha sat at her desk and pulled out an old photograph. In it, a young Jake "Thunder" McKenna stood tall, beside her late husband, both men grinning after a successful cattle drive. She studied Jake's stance, the way he held himself, and thought of Daniel moving through the breaking pen. The resemblance was there, in 100 tiny ways she couldn't quite name. A soft knock at her door broke her reverie. "Come in," she called, quickly returning the photograph to its drawer. Daniel stepped inside, still dusty from the day's work, his eyes carefully avoiding direct contact. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for the opportunity here. I know I'm not the most skilled hand you've got." Martha cut him off with a wave of her hand. "You did good work today, Daniel. That's a difficult horse you gentled." She paused, watching his face carefully. "Reminded me of someone I used to know. He had a way with horses, too." For just a moment, something flickered in Daniel's eyes. Pain, perhaps, or memory. Before. He carefully smoothed his expression. "Just got lucky, I suppose," he said, turning to leave. But Martha noticed how he moved through her door with that same liquid grace he'd shown in the pen, all pretense of awkwardness forgotten in an unguarded moment. She waited until his footsteps faded before pulling out the photograph again. Yes, there was something about Daniel McKenna that didn't add up, and Martha Stewart had a feeling she wasn't the only one who'd start noticing. The question was, how long could a young man keep playing a part that was starting to wear thin at the edges? And what would happen when someone finally saw through it? The saloon in Cedar Springs was doing brisk business as the afternoon heat drove cowboys in for relief. Through the swinging doors walked Tom Wesley, his face creased with worry as he made his way to Martha Stewart's table. She could read the news in his expression before he even sat down. "Carson gang hit the Miller place last night," Tom said without preamble, his voice low. "Took their whole herd, left old Jim Miller with a broken arm." He gestured for whiskey, and Martha noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "They're getting bolder, Martha, working their way through the valley, ranch by ranch." In the corner of the saloon, Daniel McKenna sat nursing a glass of water, seemingly absorbed in his own thoughts. But Martha had noticed how his shoulders tensed at the mention of the Carson gang, how his fingers drummed once, briefly, against his glass before going still. "That's the third ranch this month," Martha said, keeping her voice steady despite the cold fear settling in her stomach. "Where are the lawmen in all this?" Tom's bitter laugh told its own story. "Sheriff Davies says he's doing what he can, but—" He shrugged eloquently. "Word is, the Carson boys have friends in high places." As they talked, the saloon doors swung open again, admitting Martha's daughter Sarah, her riding clothes dusty. From the trail, she moved with her mother's confidence, nodding to familiar faces as she made her way through the crowd. Daniel's eyes followed her movement, though he quickly looked away when she glanced in his direction. "Mother," Sarah said, reaching their table. "Mr. Wesley." She pulled up a chair, her expression serious. "I've just come from the Miller place. It's worse than they're saying. The gang didn't just take the herd. They left messages. They're not even trying to hide anymore." Martha watched as Daniel shifted in his seat, his water glass forgotten. She'd noticed how her daughter and the young ranch hand had been circling each other these past weeks, neither quite ready to acknowledge the tension building between them. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Daniel stood at the fence of the north pasture, lost in memories. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew him back to the present, but he didn't turn as Sarah rode up beside him. "Thinking deep thoughts?" she asked, swinging down from her horse. When he didn't respond, Immediately, she added, you had that same look yesterday when Tom was talking about the Carson gang. Daniel's hand moved unconsciously to his side, where a gun might have rested. Just wondering about choices, he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed beyond his years, about what a man has to do when the time comes. Sarah studied his profile in the fading light. You're not what you pretend to be, are you? It wasn't really a question. I've watched you these past months. The way you move when you think no one's looking, the way you handle yourself around horses. My mother sees it too. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. I had a father once. He taught me things I've been trying to forget. Why forget? Sarah pressed, stepping closer. Why hide who you are? Daniel turned to face her, and for the first time she saw something fierce and wounded in his eyes. Because my father's lessons came with a price I'm not sure I'm ready to pay. The moment was broken by the thunder of approaching horses. Both turned to see Hank riding hard toward them, his face grim in the twilight. Miss Sarah, Daniel, we've got trouble. 3 of our best horses are missing from the south pasture. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. The Carson gang? Hank nodded grimly. Found their tracks heading east, and they left this. He handed Sarah a crude note. The message was simple. More to come. Daniel read the note over her shoulder, and something changed in his stance. For just a moment, Sarah saw a different man entirely. Someone dangerous. Someone who knew exactly how to handle trouble when it came calling. That night, Daniel sat alone in his small room above the stable, a worn leather journal open in his lap. By lamplight, he read his father's last words, written the night before Jake "Thunder" McKenna made his final stand. Son, there comes a time when a man can't run from who he is, when the world needs what he knows, what he can do. I've taught you everything I could, hoping you'd never need it, but if you're reading this, then trouble's found you. Remember, a McKenna doesn't draw first, but he always draws fastest. It's not about the glory. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. Daniel closed the journal, his father's voice echoing in his memory. Outside, a horse whinnied in the darkness, and he found himself checking his father's old gun belt hidden beneath the floorboards. Soon, he knew, he'd have to make a choice between keeping his secret and keeping people safe. In the main house, Martha sat at her desk, reading old newspaper clippings about Jake McKenna's last gunfight. The similarities between father and son were becoming clearer each day, and she worried about what that might mean for her ranch, her daughter, and the quiet young man carrying such a heavy legacy. Sarah stood at her bedroom window, watching the lights in Daniel's room. She thought about the way he'd changed when reading the gang's note, how natural he'd looked in that moment of revelation, like his true self showing through a crack in a carefully maintained facade. Thunder rolled in the distance, promising rain, but Martha Stewart knew different kinds of storms were gathering. The Carson gang was coming, pushing closer to Broken Spoke Ranch with each passing day. And somehow, she suspected, the quiet young man in her employ was going to be at the center of whatever was coming. The question was, when the storm finally broke, would Daniel McKenna stand and fight as his father's son, or keep running from a legacy written in gunsmoke and legend? The Carson gang rode into Broken Spoke Ranch like a dark tide, 7 men on dust-covered horses, their spurs singing a threatening melody against the morning quiet. Luke Carson led them, his scarred face twisted in a perpetual sneer as he surveyed. The ranch hands gathering near the corral. Behind him, his brother Matt fingered his rifle with practiced menace, while the others spread out in a loose semicircle. Daniel was mending tack in the shade of the stable when they arrived. He kept his head down, his hands steady on the leather, but his eyes missed nothing. He counted weapons, 12 revolvers, 7 rifles, and Buck Carson's favorite skinning, knife sheathed at his hip, each detail catalogued and filed away with an instinct he'd inherited from his father. "Well, ain't this a nice spread?" Luke Carson called out, his voice carrying across the yard. Shame if anything were to happen to it. His eyes swept the assembled ranch hands before settling on Daniel. You there, boy? Where's the owner? Before Daniel could respond, Martha Stewart emerged from the main house, shotgun held casually in the crook of her arm. Sarah stood in the doorway behind her, hand resting near the revolver at her hip, a sight that made Daniel's chest tighten with worry. I'm Martha Stewart, she announced, her voice clear and unwavering. State your business or ride out. Luke Carson's laugh was ugly. Ma'am, we're just being neighborly. Heard you lost some horses. Thought we might help look for them. His men chuckled, the sound like rocks in a tin can. Funny, Martha replied, considering my hands tracked those horses straight toward your camp before the trails went cold. The atmosphere shifted, tension crackling like heat lightning before a storm. Matt Carson's rifle lifted slightly, and Daniel felt his muscles coil in response, years of training rising to the surface. Careful now, Luke warned, his hand dropping to his gun. Accusations like that could get messy. Speaking of messy, his gaze fixed on Daniel. You, boy, you look like you need a lesson in respect. Daniel kept his movements deliberately clumsy, as he set aside the tack and stood. No trouble wanted here, mister, he said, pitching his voice higher than natural, playing the part of the nervous youth. Buck Carson dismounted, his spurs raising dust as he stalked toward Daniel. Let's see what you're made of, boy. He drew his knife, the blade catching sunlight. Maybe we'll start with that pretty face of yours. The other ranch hands shifted uneasily, but none moved to intervene. They'd seen the Carson gang's handiwork before. The smart play was to stay quiet and hope the storm passed quickly. Buck lunged suddenly, the knife slashing in a practiced arc. To most observers, it looked like Daniel stumbled backwards in panic, but Martha, watching intently, saw how his stumble placed him perfectly out of the blade's reach while maintaining his appearance of incompetence. Clumsy little rabbit, Buck taunted, advancing again. This time his knife hand moved in a complex pattern, the kind of attack that had left men scarred or dead in a dozen border towns. Daniel's response was a masterpiece of deception. He appeared to trip over his own feet, yet somehow the knife missed him by millimeters. As he fell, his hand brushed Buck's gun belt, a touch so light and quick that no one noticed the subtle change in the holster's angle. Look at him dance, Matt Carson jeered from his horse, like a puppet with tangled strings. Buck moved in for the kill, confidence making him careless. But this time, when Daniel stumbled, something changed. His foot hooked behind Buck's knee, at precisely the right angle. His seemingly panicked grab at Buck's shirt transformed into a perfect throw that sent the larger man crashing to the ground. The knife went flying, and when Buck reached for his gun, he found his holster had been subtly repositioned during Daniel's earlier clumsy fall. The weapon caught, giving him a crucial half-second of fumbling. In that moment, Daniel's transformation was stunning. Gone was the awkward ranch hand, replaced by something deadly and precise. His hand moved with blinding speed, drawing a hidden derringer from his boot. Before anyone could blink, the small gun was pressed against Buck's temple. Drop it, Daniel said softly, his voice changed, carrying the kind of authority that made even hardened killers pause. His eyes, no longer avoiding contact, fixed on Luke Carson with an intensity that made the gang leader's horse step nervously sideways. The yard had gone deathly quiet. Luke Carson's face worked through a series of emotions: surprise, anger, and then something close to fear as he really looked at Daniel for the first time. Who the hell are you, boy? Daniel's thumb pulled back the derringer's hammer with a click that seemed to echo across the suddenly still ranch yard. Someone who's giving you a chance to ride out of here intact. There was an edge to his voice now, a familiar cadence that made Martha's breath catch in recognition. Luke Carson's hand tightened on his gun belt, calculation warring with pride. You think one little derringer makes you a big man? 7 of us, 1 of you. Count again, Sarah's voice rang out. She'd moved to the edge of the porch, her revolver now drawn and aimed with the steady hand of someone who'd grown up learning to protect what was hers. More hammers cocked as Martha's shotgun rose, and several ranch hands found their courage. But it was something else that finally made Luke Carson raise his hands slowly from his guns. The way Daniel held himself now, all pretense stripped away, revealing a lethal grace that spoke of years of training. "My father," Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, "taught me that the number of guns doesn't matter as much as the will to use them." His eyes never left Luke's face. "Ride out. Don't come back. Next time won't be a warning." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Luke Carson nodded slowly, a gesture heavy with both respect and hatred. "Mount up," he ordered his men. As Buck stumbled to his feet, Luke added, "We'll remember this, boy." "That's the idea," Daniel replied softly. The gang rode out in a cloud of dust and muttered threats. Only when they were well away did Daniel's stance relax slightly, though his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. He tucked the derringer back into his boot, movements economic and practiced. Martha stepped down from the porch, her shotgun still ready. "That was your father's move," she said quietly. "The trip and disarm. Jake used it in Laredo, back in '59. Daniel turned to face her, no longer hiding behind the mask of the fumbling ranch hand. "You knew him." It wasn't a question, but Martha nodded anyway. "Knew him, respected him, saw him teach that same move to his son about 15 years ago." Her eyes were knowing. "A son who'd be about your age now." Sarah joined them, her revolver holstered but her hand staying close. "They'll be back," she said, her voice grim, "with more men." Daniel nodded, looking at the dust cloud disappearing into the distance. "Yes," he agreed, "they will." His hand brushed unconsciously against his boot where the derringer rested. "And next time, they'll know what they're riding into." The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows on the ranch yard, but darker shadows were gathering on the horizon, and in them rode 7 men with wounded pride and a thirst for revenge. The quiet life Daniel had built for himself was unraveling, thread by thread, and in its place his father's legacy was emerging as unstoppable as the tide. News of the confrontation at Broken Spoke Ranch spread through Cedar Springs like wildfire. By sundown, the saloon buzzed with whispered conversations and wild speculation. Old-timers huddled in corners, sharing stories of Jake "Thunder" McKenna, with a newfound urgency, their eyes darting to the doors whenever they opened. Behind the bar, Pete Wilson pulled out a yellowed wanted poster from 15 years ago. The sketch showed a man with hard eyes and a steady gaze. The reward amount, long since faded. $5,000, he muttered, studying the face that had haunted the territory's nightmares. That was serious money back then. The saloon's chatter died as Martha Stewart pushed through the swinging doors, her boots leaving dusty prints on the wooden floor. She made her way to the bar, noting how conversations shifted to whispers in her wake. "Pete?" She nodded to the bartender, who quickly rolled up the wanted poster, but not before she'd seen it. "Interesting reading material." Pete poured her usual whiskey without asking. "People are talking, Martha, about your new hand, about how he moved today." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "They're saying he fights, like Thunder McKenna." "People say a lot of things," Martha replied evenly, but her mind wandered to the morning's events, to the fluid grace with which Daniel had disarmed Buck Carson, to the look in his eyes that had made hardened outlaws back down. The door creaked again, admitting Sheriff Davies. The lawman's weathered face was creased with concern as he approached Martha. "Mrs. Stewart, mind if we talk?" They found a quiet corner table, away from straining ears. Davies removed his hat, running fingers through graying hair. "Got word about what happened at your place. Carson gang's not known for backing down. They'll be back." "We can handle our own troubles, Sheriff," Martha said, studying his face. Something in his expression set off warning bells. "That's not why. I'm here." He pulled out a folded paper from his vest. "Got this telegram from the territorial marshal. They're interested in your new hand." Martha's fingers tightened around her glass. "Daniel's done nothing wrong." "Maybe not," Davies agreed, carefully. "But if he's who they think he is, who we all think he is, there's going to be trouble. Jake McKenna had enemies, powerful ones, ones who haven't forgotten." Back at the ranch, Daniel stood in his small room, the floorboards pulled up to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside lay his father's gun belt, the leather still supple despite the years. The revolver's pearl handle caught the lamplight as he lifted it out, feeling its familiar weight. A soft knock at his door made him freeze. "Daniel?" Sarah's voice. "Can we talk?" He quickly replaced the boards, but didn't hide the gun. Something in him knew it was time to stop hiding. "Come in." Sarah's eyes went straight to the pearl-handled revolver. "I found some old newspapers in Mother's study," she said without preamble. "About Jake McKenna, about his last stand." She met his gaze steadily. "About his son who disappeared that same night." Daniel ran his thumb along the gun's hammer, a gesture so familiar it hurt. "I was 12, he said softly. "Pa knew they were coming. Told me to ride east, not to look back. I heard the gunfire from 3 miles away. They said he took 4 of them with him." 5, Daniel corrected quietly. "The papers got it wrong. He wouldn't want to be remembered for the killing, though. Pa only drew when he had to, taught me the same." Sarah moved closer, her hand hovering over the revolver. "Is that why you've been hiding, playing the fumbling ranch hand?" "Partly." Daniel set the gun down. "Pa had a saying, a man who builds his life on a gun dies by the gun. I wanted something different, something quiet." He looked out the window at the ranch that had become home. "But sometimes quiet isn't a choice we get to make." The next morning, Martha found Daniel at the corral, watching the sunrise. Without preamble, she said, "Sheriff Davies came to see me last night. The territorial marshal's asking questions." Daniel didn't turn. "About Jake McKenna's son?" "Yes." Martha stepped up beside him. "Daniel, I knew your father. He was a good man. Saved this ranch once, saved my husband's life too. But he made powerful enemies." "The Kingsley family," Daniel said, naming the cattle barons who'd orchestrated his father's death. "I know. They're still out there." Martha's voice was gentle but firm. "The Carson gang working these parts. It's not a coincidence. The Kingsleys have always wanted this valley. Now they're using hired guns to do what they couldn't do 15 years ago." Daniel finally turned to face her, his father's eyes staring. Out of his young face, "I won't run again, Mrs. Stewart, not this time." "I know," Martha said softly. "That's what worries me." She touched his arm briefly before walking away, leaving Daniel to watch the sun climb higher over the land his father had died protecting. Evening cast long shadows across the broken spoke ranch as Sarah practiced with her revolver behind the barn. Her shots were good, but not good enough, not with the storm that was coming. The tin can she'd set up remained stubbornly unmoved after her last 3 attempts. "You're anticipating the recoil," Daniel's voice came from behind her. "Makes you pull down just before you fire." Sarah turned to find him leaning against the barn door, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. "Show me," she said, offering him. "The gun," Daniel shook his head. "Keep yours. Watch." He drew the pearl-handled revolver so smoothly it seemed to materialize in his hand. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession, each one taking a can off the fence at different distances. The sound echoed across the empty pasture like thunder. "How do you make it look so easy?" Sarah asked, attempting to mirror his stance. "Practice," he said, moving closer, "and knowing that every shot might be the one that keeps you alive." His hands gently adjusted her grip. My father spent 5 years teaching me before he'd let me carry. And now you're teaching me. Sarah's voice was soft. Does that mean you're staying, really staying? Before Daniel could answer, hoofbeats approached. Hank rode up, his face grim. Daniel, Mrs. Stewart needs you both. Riders coming in from town. They found Martha on the porch, watching a cloud of dust approaching from the east. 3 riders emerged from it, and Daniel recognized Tom Wesley leading them. "Martha!" Tom called out as they got closer. "Got news you need to hear. The Carson gang, they're recruiting, offering good money to every gun hand between here and Fort Worth." Martha's expression remained steady, but her knuckles whitened. On the porch railing. "How many?" 15 so far, maybe more coming. Word is they're camping at Shadow Creek. Tom's eyes found Daniel. "They're asking questions about Thunder McKenna's boy, too. Offering extra for information." Daniel felt Sarah, tense beside him. His hand found his father's gun, the pearl grip cool against his palm. "Let them ask," he said quietly. Martha turned to him. "This isn't just about you anymore, Daniel. They'll burn this whole valley to get to you." "No." Daniel's voice was firm. "They'll try to burn it anyway. The Kingsleys want this land. I'm just their excuse." He looked at Sarah, then back to Martha. "But I can teach our people to fight, like my father taught me." Tom shifted in his saddle. Jake McKenna was one man. He died fighting them alone. "He didn't have a choice," Daniel said. "I do, and I choose not to make his mistake." He stepped forward. "The Kingsleys want a war? Fine. But this time, Thunder McKenna's son isn't running, and he's not fighting alone." Later that night, as lamps burned in the bunkhouse, Daniel stood before the ranch. Hands, men who'd worked beside him for months, never knowing who he was. Some looked uncertain, others determined. "I won't lie to you," he said, his voice carrying to every corner. "What's coming is dangerous. Anyone who wants to leave should leave now. No shame in it." No one moved. Hank spoke up from the back. "This is our home too, boy. Might not be gunslingers, but we know which end of a rifle works." Daniel nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "Then let's get started. First lessons about cover, how to use it, how to deny it to them. By the time they come, this ranch will be ready." Sarah watched from the doorway as Daniel began teaching, transforming from quiet ranch hand to skilled tactician. She saw his father's legacy in every move, every instruction, but she also saw something Jake McKenna might have missed. The power of having someone worth fighting for. The night wore on, and as Daniel taught his father's art to men who'd become his family, the stars wheeled overhead. Tomorrow would bring more preparation, more decisions. The Carson gang was coming, and with them the revenge of the Kingsley family. But tonight, in this room, the legend of Thunder McKenna wasn't just a story of a lone gunman's last stand. It was becoming something new, a legacy of protection, of standing together against those who would take by force what they couldn't claim by right. Outside, the wind carried the promise of change, and somewhere in the darkness, 15 hired. Guns prepared for a fight they thought they understood. They were wrong. They were riding against a ghost son, yes. But this time, that son had found something his father never had. A family worth fighting beside and a home worth defending. To the last bullet. The town of Cedar Springs had never seen anything quite like it. 3 of the Carson gang's new recruits swaggered down Main Street, their confidence fueled by whiskey and the promise of easy money. They'd come to deliver a message. But what they didn't know was that they were about to become part of one instead. Daniel sat at his usual corner table in the saloon, a glass of water before him when they entered. The piano player stopped mid-note, and conversations died as the 3 men spread out, their gun hands conspicuously close to their holsters. "Well, look what we've found," the tallest one drawled, his spurs jingling as he approached Daniel's table. Thunder McKenna's little cub, trying to hide in plain sight. Daniel didn't look up from his glass. "You're blocking my light," he said softly, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. The man's face reddened. "Maybe you didn't hear me, boy. We're here to die?" Daniel's eyes finally met his, and something in that gaze made the man step back. "Because that's what's going to happen if you don't walk out that door right now." The second man, wearing a red bandana, drew his gun, or tried to. Somehow Daniel was already moving, his chair falling away as his hand descended to his side. What happened next would be talked about in Cedar Springs for years to come. Daniel's draw was like lightning, not just fast, but with a fluid grace that seemed to bend time itself. His father's pearl-handled revolver appeared as if by magic, and 3 shots rang out in such rapid succession that they seemed to blend into one continuous roll of thunder. When the echo faded, 3 guns lay on the floor, their owners nursing. Hands that had been shot with surgical precision. No fatal wounds, no blood on the floor. Just 3 disarmed men staring in disbelief at the young man who now stood at the center of the saloon, gun held loose but ready at his side. "My father," Daniel said, his voice pitched to carry, "had a signature shot. Could disarm a man without killing him. Took me 5 years to master it." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Tell Luke Carson that Thunder McKenna's son sends his regards. And tell the Kingsleys that this time they're not just facing one man." Sarah burst through the saloon doors, her own gun drawn, having heard the shots from across the street. She took in the scene, the 3 disarmed men, the untouched glass of water on Daniel's table, and the familiar pearl-handled revolver in his hand. "You missed the show," Daniel said, not taking his eyes off the 3 men. "Somehow I don't think—" "It'll be the last one," she replied, moving to stand beside him. Pete, the bartender, emerged from behind his counter, a shotgun in his hands. "Want me to send for the sheriff?" "No need." Daniel holstered his gun with the same liquid grace he'd drawn it. "These men were just leaving. Weren't you, gentlemen?" The 3 scrambled for the door, leaving their guns behind. As they mounted their horses, the tall one turned back. "Carson's got 15 guns riding with him now. You can't take them all." 16, Daniel corrected. "Saw the tracks of your new recruit this morning. But numbers aren't everything." He stepped out onto the boardwalk. "A wolf pack's only as strong as its alpha. Remember that." After they'd ridden away, Sarah touched Daniel's arm. "You knew they were coming." He nodded. "Saw them ride in. Figured. It was time to send a message of our own." He looked down at his father's gun. "Pa always said sometimes you have to show your hand to prevent a bigger fight. Did it work?" Daniel watched the dust settle on the street. "No. But now they know what they're riding into. And fear's a powerful thing in a gunfight." By sundown, word of the saloon incident had spread throughout the valley. Martha found an old wanted poster of Jake McKenna in her study and stared at it for a long time. The face in the sketch was older, harder, but the eyes, they were the same ones she'd seen in the young man who'd just pulled off a feat that would have made his father proud. In the growing darkness, Daniel stood at the ranch's fence line, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of blood red. Sarah joined him, her shoulder brushing his. "Mother found more old papers," she said, "about your father's last stand. She thinks she knows why the Kingsleys want this land so badly." Daniel turned to her, seeing the worry in her eyes. "Tell me." "There's gold in Shadow Creek. Has been all along. Your father knew. That's why he helped our families hold this valley. The Kingsleys found out, and that's why they killed him," Daniel finished. He looked out at the land that had cost his father's life, that might yet cost more. "Pa used to say every piece of ground's worth fighting for, if it's fought for the right reasons." Sarah's hand found his. "And what are your reasons?" Daniel's fingers intertwined with hers, his father's gun a comfortable weight at his hip. "Same as his were, protecting what's right." He looked down at her. Protecting who's right? The sun dipped below the horizon, taking the day's heat with it, but everyone in Cedar Springs could feel it. Something was building, like the pressure before a storm. The Carson gang was out there, growing stronger, and the Kingsleys were pulling strings from the shadows. But for the first time in 15 years, Thunder McKenna's legend wasn't just a cautionary tale of a lone man's last stand. It was becoming a rally cry, a promise of protection carried forward by a son who'd finally found something worth standing his ground for. Luke Carson paced the Shadow Creek camp like a caged mountain lion, his face twisted with rage as he listened to his 3 men recount their humiliation in Cedar Springs. Around the campfire, 15 hardened gunmen watched and waited, measuring the young McKenna's threat against their promised pay. "Shot the guns right out of their hands," the man in the red bandana muttered, still nursing his stinging fingers. "Never seen anything like it, just like his father." Luke spat into the fire. "His father died bleeding in the dirt. He ain't nothing special." But his voice carried a note of uncertainty that his men had never heard before. In a tent at the edge of camp, a man in an expensive Eastern suit penned a letter by lamplight. Richard Kingsley III had not come all the way from Boston to watch hired guns fail. The letter to his father would need careful wording. Explaining why Thunder McKenna's son had been allowed to live this long would not be easy. Dawn broke over Broken Spoke Ranch to find wagons arriving from neighboring spreads. Word had spread about Daniel's stand in town, and with it came something the valley hadn't known in years: hope. Tom Wesley's outfit rolled in first, followed by the Miller family, then the Hansons. By mid-morning, representatives from every ranch in the valley had gathered in Martha's barn. Daniel stood before them, no longer hiding his natural authority. "The Carson gang isn't just after Broken Spoke," he said, his voice carrying to the rafters. "They want the whole valley. The Kingsleys want what's in Shadow Creek, and they don't care how many of us they have to go through to get it." "Why should we trust you?" Old Jim Miller spoke up, his broken arm still in a sling from the Carson gang's last visit. "Your father's reputation brought nothing but trouble to these parts." "My father died protecting this land," Daniel replied quietly. "But he made a mistake. He tried to do it alone." He looked around the barn, meeting each person's eyes. "I'm not asking you to trust my name. I'm asking you to trust in each other. Together we're stronger than any hired guns." Sarah stepped forward, unrolling a map of the valley onto a hay bale. "We've marked every trail, every water source, every defensible position. The Carson gang thinks they know this land. We'll show them how wrong they are." The morning turned to afternoon as plans were made, strategies formed. Daniel moved among the ranchers, teaching quick-draw techniques, showing them how to fortify their homes. Martha watched from the loft, seeing how naturally leadership sat on his shoulders. "He's different from his father," Tom Wesley said, climbing up to join her. "Jake was a lone wolf. Daniel, he builds something stronger. He builds family," Martha replied softly, watching as Daniel showed Sarah's younger brother how to sight down a rifle properly. The sun was setting when a rider appeared. On the ridge above the ranch, the warning bell rang out, and within moments, every rancher had taken cover, rifles ready. But the rider made no aggressive move, just sat there, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Daniel walked out into the yard, his father's gun at his side. Through his spyglass, he recognized the rider, Cal Jenkins, one of the best trackers in the territory, a man who'd once ridden with his father. "Evening, young McKenna," Cal called down. "Thought you should know. 2 more gun hands joined the Carson gang today. Brothers, the Reeves boys from down El Paso way." "Appreciate the warning," Daniel replied. "Why are you really here, Cal?" The old tracker's laugh carried on the wind. "Your pa saved my life in '57. Figure I owe the family line one last favor." He paused. "They're coming, boy. 3 days, maybe 4. Kingsley's getting impatient." After Cal rode away, Sarah found Daniel at the fence line, his face thoughtful in the gathering dark. "The Reeves brothers," she said. "Mother's heard of them?" "Everyone has," Daniel nodded. "Fast guns, mean tempers. Pa always said they were. More rattlesnake than human?" His hand rested on the pearl grip of his revolver. "But even rattlers can be handled if you know how." Back in the barn, the ranchers continued their preparations, the air thick with determination and quiet fear. They were no army, these farmers and ranchers, but they had something Carson's hired guns didn't, a home worth fighting for, and now a leader worth following. The night deepened, bringing with it the howl of distant coyotes. In Shadow Creek camp, 18 killers cleaned their guns and dreamed of easy money. But in the valley's ranches, free men and women prepared for a storm that would either destroy them or forge them into something unbreakable. And in his room above the stable, Daniel McKenna cleaned his father's gun and remembered old lessons. "A man's legacy," Jake had told him once, "isn't in how many he kills, it's in what he protects." Looking out at the ranch that had become his home, at the valley his father had died defending, Daniel finally understood. Thunder McKenna's legacy wasn't in his gun. It was in the choice to stand and fight for something bigger than himself. The old trunk creaked as Martha Stewart lifted its lid in her study, dust motes dancing in the lamplight. Inside lay the past, carefully preserved. Photographs, letters, and newspaper clippings about the night that changed everything. Sarah sat beside her mother as they sifted through the yellowed papers. "Here," Martha said softly, pulling out a daguerreotype. "Your father took this, the day after we found the gold in Shadow Creek." The image showed Jake McKenna and a group of men standing by the creek, their faces triumphant. "None of us knew what that discovery would cost." Sarah studied the photograph. Jake McKenna stood tall, his legendary pearl-handled revolver visible at his hip. His eyes held the same quiet intensity she now saw in his son. Did father know they were coming for him that night? Martha's hands trembled slightly as she withdrew a folded letter. Yes, Jake warned him, told him to get everyone out of the valley. Her voice grew distant, remembering. Your father wanted to stay and fight, but Jake insisted he protect his family, said some fights a man had to face alone. The memory took her back 15 years to that moonless night when gunfire echoed through the valley. Jake McKenna stood on his porch, watching the darkness. He'd sent his son east with nothing but a horse, a canteen, and a promise to stay alive. Behind him, his wife Rebecca loaded rifles with steady hands. "They're coming," she said simply. Jake nodded. "Kingsley's men. At least 12 of them." He turned to her, his face soft in the lamplight. "You should go, Beck. There's still time." Rebecca chambered around. "I didn't marry Thunder McKenna because he was easy to live with. I'm not leaving now because he's hard to die with." The first shots came just before midnight. Jake and Rebecca held them off for hours, their combined skill dropping 5 of Kingsley's men before dawn. But as the sun rose, a bullet found Rebecca. She died in Jake's arms, whispered words meant only for their son's ears. Jake McKenna's last stand became legend. He killed 3 more before they finally brought him down. But what the stories didn't tell, what only Martha Stewart knew, was that his final act wasn't violence, it was protection. He'd burned the maps to the gold deposits, ensuring the Kingsleys would never find them without help from the valley's families. In the present, Sarah pulled out another document, a letter from Jake to Daniel, never delivered. Martha recognized the handwriting. "He wrote that the morning of the attack, asked my husband to keep it safe." Sarah read aloud, "Son, if you're reading this, then what we feared has happened. The Kingsleys want more than just our land. They want what lies beneath it. I die knowing I've kept it from them, knowing you're safe." But a father's greatest hope is that his son will learn from his mistakes. I stood alone because pride told me I had to. Don't follow my path. Find people worth fighting beside. Build something stronger than one man's legend. The door opened quietly, admitting Daniel. He'd aged years in days, responsibility settling on him like an old familiar coat. "Mrs. Stewart," he said softly. "Cal Jenkins is back. Says he found something you need to see." They followed him to the barn, where the old tracker waited. Cal's weathered hands held a battered tin box. "Found this buried up by Thunder's old place," he said. "Figure it's time it came home." Daniel opened the box with careful fingers. Inside lay his mother's wedding ring, a handful of letters, and a folded paper marked with his father's bold script, "For my son, when he's ready to stop running." The map inside showed Shadow Creek in detail, with markings only the valley's families would understand. Jake's last message to his son was scrawled across the bottom. "The gold means nothing. The people worth dying for, they mean everything." Sarah watched Daniel's face as he read his father's words. "You're not him," she said quietly. "You're not alone." Daniel's fingers traced the map's worn edges. "No," he agreed, looking up at the faces around him. Martha's quiet strength, Cal's weathered loyalty, Sarah's fierce determination. "I'm not alone, and maybe that's why we'll win." Outside, thunder rolled across the valley, nature's echo of a dead man's name. But inside the barn, his son stood surrounded by allies, finally understanding that his father's greatest legacy wasn't his skill with a gun, but his willingness to die, protecting others. Now, 15 years later, Daniel McKenna would show the Kingsleys and their hired guns that some legacies grow stronger with time. And this time, Thunder's son wasn't fighting just for revenge or pride. He was fighting for family, for home, for the future his father had died to protect. Cedar Springs' dusty Main Street fell silent as Luke Carson and 5 of his men rode in, their horses' hooves echoing off the wooden boardwalks. Shopkeepers quietly closed their doors, and mothers hurried their children inside. In front of the saloon, the gang's leader dismounted, his spurs ringing against the hard-packed earth. "McKenna!" Carson's voice boomed through the quiet town. "Get out here, boy. Time to finish what your daddy started." Inside the saloon, Daniel sat at his usual corner table, Sarah beside him. Their fingers were intertwined beneath the table, but his face showed nothing but calm as Pete the bartender approached. "You don't have to answer him," Pete said quietly. "We can send for the marshal." Daniel squeezed Sarah's hand once before letting go. "Marshal's 3 days' ride away. Besides," he stood slowly, checking his father's gun with practiced ease, "some challenges you can't walk away from." Sarah caught his arm. "Daniel, they'll have men hidden on the roofs. This is a trap." "I know." He smiled slightly. "Good thing we planned for that." His eyes met hers. "Trust me," she nodded, her hand dropping to her own holster. "Always." Daniel pushed through the saloon doors, stepping out into the harsh sunlight. Luke Carson stood in the street, flanked by his men. But Daniel's eyes caught the subtle movements on the rooftops. 4 more gunmen, just as Sarah had warned. "Heard. You've been practicing your father's tricks," Carson called out. "Impressive, but tricks won't save you today." "Like tricks didn't save my father?" Daniel's voice carried clearly in the tense silence. "Or like they didn't save your men at the ranch?" Carson's face darkened. "You've got spirit, boy, but you're outnumbered. And Mr. Kingsley's offering a mighty fine bonus for your head." "Kingsley!" Daniel spat the name like a curse. "Hyde's too precious to do his own killing, so he sends dogs to do his work." His eyes swept the street. "Tell me, Carson, did he mention what happened to the last bunch of killers he sent after my father?" A stir of unease rippled through Carson's men. They'd all heard the stories of Thunder McKenna's last stand, of how many men he'd taken with him. "Your father's dead," Carson snarled, "and you're about to join him." Daniel's laugh was soft but carried. Look around, Carson. Notice anything different? His eyes flicked meaningfully to the rooftops. Carson's gaze followed, and his confidence faltered. Where his hidden gunman had been, he now saw Tom Wesley and other ranchers, rifles trained on. His men, more armed townspeople, emerged from doorways and alleys surrounding the gang. "See, that was my father's mistake," Daniel continued, his hand resting easily near his gun. "He thought he had to face everything alone. But me?" He smiled as Sarah stepped out beside him, her revolver drawn. "I've got family." "Doesn't change anything." Carson's hand hovered over his gun. "Still ends with you in the dirt." "Maybe." Daniel's voice hardened. "But how many of your men are willing to die for Kingsley's gold? Because that's what this is really about, isn't it? The Shadow Creek deposits?" The gang members exchanged uncertain looks. They'd been told this was about land rights, about teaching uppity ranchers a lesson. Gold changed things. "Here's my challenge, Carson," Daniel said. "Ride out, take your men. Tell Kingsley that Shadow Creek stays in the valley's hands, or stay and find out if you're faster than my father's son." "You think these farmers scare me?" Carson's voice rose. "I've got 18 killers." "Had 18. Daniel corrected. 3 quit this morning. Seems word of what happened in town got around. Your reputation's not what it used to be." A bead of sweat rolled down Carson's temple. His men were shifting nervously, counting the rifles aimed at them, weighing their pay against their lives. "Last chance," Daniel said softly. "Ride out or draw." For a long moment, the street held its breath. Then Carson's hand dropped to his gun. It was a mistake. Daniel's draw was invisible, a blur of motion that seemed to bend time. Thunder rolled from his father's pearl-handled revolver, and Carson's gun went spinning into the dust, along with 2 of his men's weapons. "Next time," Daniel's voice was cold, "I won't aim for the guns." Carson stared at his bleeding hand, then at the young man who'd outdrawn him so completely. Without a word, he mounted his horse. His men followed, their earlier bravado replaced by silent fear. As they rode out, Sarah touched Daniel's arm. "They'll be back." "Yes." He watched the dust cloud fade. "But not today. And when they do come back—" He looked around at the armed townspeople, the ranchers on the rooftops, the community that had come together to stand against tyranny. "They'll find more than they bargained for." The sun climbed higher over Cedar Springs, its light catching the pearl handle of Thunder McKenna's gun, now wielded by a son who'd learned that true strength isn't found in standing alone, but in standing together. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The morning after Carson's challenge, the valley seemed too quiet, like the stillness before a tornado. He stood on the porch of Broken Spoke Ranch, watching Sheriff Davies ride up the path, a cloud of dust in his wake. "Sheriff," Daniel nodded, noting how the lawman's hand rested too casually near his gun. "Early for a social call." "Got word from the territorial marshal," Davies said, dismounting. "Thought you should know they're sending men. About the gold." Martha appeared in the doorway, shotgun held loosely in her arms. "Funny," she said, her voice cold. "I just got a telegram from the marshal himself. They're not sending anyone." The sheriff's friendly mask slipped for just a moment, but it was enough. Daniel's hand moved toward his gun, but Davies was already drawing. "Don't!" the sheriff barked. "Or they'll kill her right now." Daniel froze. "Who?" "Sarah." Davies smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Been watching her take her morning ride for weeks now. Creature of habit, that girl." Martha's face went pale. "How long? How long have I been working with the Kingsleys?" Davies laughed bitterly. "Since before Jake McKenna's last stand. Who do you think told them about the gold in the first place?" He kept his gun trained on Daniel. 15 years waiting for my share. Watching you people act like you owned something that could make a man rich beyond dreams." "Where is she?" Daniel's voice was deadly quiet. "Safe. For now." Davies pulled a piece of paper from his vest. "Got a message for you, boy. From Richard. Kingsley himself. He wants to make a trade. The girl for the map your father left." Daniel's mind raced. The map was safely hidden in Martha's study, its code known only to the Valley's original families. But Sarah? How do I know she's alive? Davies produced a silver locket, Sarah's, the one her father had given her. "Took this off her neck myself. She's at the old McKenna place. Poetic, ain't it? Where your father made his last stand." His grin turned ugly. "You've got 1 hour. Come alone with the map or we start sending her back to her mother in pieces." After Davies rode out, Daniel turned to Martha. Her face was a mask of fury and fear. It was him, she whispered. All those years ago he led them to Jake, and now he's doing it again, Daniel finished. He checked his father's gun, the pearl handle smooth under his fingers. "But he's made a mistake." "What's that?" "He thinks he's dealing with my father." Daniel's eyes were hard. "Pa died because he fought alone. I've got something he never had, people I can trust." He turned to Martha. "Get word to Tom Wesley and the others. I'll need them, but not where Davies expects." Within the hour, riders scattered across the valley, carrying messages and taking positions. Daniel rode toward his father's old homestead, the map tucked in his shirt, his mind on Sarah. But he wasn't riding alone, not really. The McKenna house stood like a ghost against the afternoon sky, its burned-out shell a monument to that bloody night 15 years ago. Daniel approached slowly, counting shapes in the shadows. 4 men on the porch, more inside probably. No sign of Sarah. "That's far enough," Davies called from the doorway. "Show me the map." Daniel pulled out the folded paper. "Show me Sarah first." A signal was given, and 2 men dragged Sarah onto the porch. Her hands were bound, but her eyes blazed with defiance. When she saw Daniel, she shook her head frantically. "Daniel, don't! It's not just Davies. Richard Kingsley's here. They're going to..." A hand clamped over her mouth, silencing her. From the dark doorway emerged a well-dressed man, his eastern suit incongruous against the ruined house. "Young Mr. McKenna," Richard Kingsley's cultured voice dripped with false warmth. "I've so looked forward to meeting you. Your father and I never had the pleasure, unfortunately. Our business was conducted," he smiled thinly, "through intermediaries." "Let her go," Daniel said quietly. "The map's worth more than revenge." "Oh, this isn't about revenge." Kingsley stepped forward. "This is about destiny. My family has waited 15 years to claim what's rightfully ours. Your father stole that destiny. Once you won't do it again." "You're right." Daniel's hand moved to his gun. "I won't do what my father did." "Don't be foolish, boy," Davies warned. "You're surrounded." "Am I?" Daniel's voice carried across the yard. "Count again, Sheriff." As if on cue, rifles appeared in the surrounding trees and rocks. Tom Wesley's voice rang out. "Drop your guns, Davies, it's over!" But Kingsley just laughed. "Did you think we wouldn't prepare for this?" He raised his hand, and more gunmen emerged from hiding. Carson's entire gang, and then some. 25 guns, Mr. McKenna. Even your father couldn't have survived those odds." "Maybe not," Daniel agreed. "But I'm not my father." His eyes met Sarah's. "And I'm not alone." The air filled with the sound of hammers being cocked as more rifles appeared. Every rancher in the valley, every townsperson who'd had enough of living under fear. They'd surrounded the old homestead, while Daniel kept Kingsley talking. "You see, Mr. Kingsley," Daniel's voice was almost gentle, "a man fighting for gold is just fighting for himself, but a man fighting for home." He nodded to Sarah. "For family. He never fights alone." The tension stretched like a bowstring pulled too tight. In the silence, thunder rolled in the distance, nature's own tribute to the legacy of a gunslinger's son who'd learned what his father never had. That true strength lies not in standing alone, but in standing together. What happened next would change the valley forever. The old McKenna homestead had become a powder keg, with Sarah's life hanging in the balance. As the two sides faced each other in the fading daylight, Daniel's mind raced through options, remembering his father's lessons about controlling the battlefield. "Mr. Kingsley," Daniel called out, his voice steady, "before this turns ugly, let's talk terms, just you and me." Kingsley's laugh was cold. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate, boy." "Look around," Daniel replied. "Your men are in the open. Mine have cover. First shot fired, you lose half your force." He paused, letting that sink in. "Besides, you haven't seen the real map yet." This caught Kingsley's attention. "Explain." "That paper in my shirt? A fake. Insurance policy." Daniel's eyes never left Sarah. "Real maps hidden, only I know where." Martha, watching from her position behind a boulder, saw what Daniel was doing. Buying time, making them think, spreading uncertainty among hired guns who suddenly weren't sure about their odds. "Inside," Kingsley decided. "You and me. The girl stays out here as insurance." Daniel nodded to Tom Wesley, their pre-arranged signal. Across the valley, riders quietly began moving into secondary positions, the real plan taking shape while Kingsley focused on the bait. Inside the burned-out house, Daniel faced Kingsley across what had once been his family's living room. The Eastern businessman looked out of place among the charred remains, his suit gathering dust. 15 years, Kingsley mused. 15 years we've searched for those gold deposits. Your father was clever, burning the original surveys. But you're not him, are you? You understand business. I understand loyalty, Daniel corrected, and I understand that gold isn't worth dying for. No, Kingsley smiled. Tell that to your father. Tell that to your mother. Daniel's hand twitched near his gun, but he held steady. Outside, he could hear horses moving, his people getting into position. Just a few more minutes. Here's my offer, Daniel said. You ride out. Leave the valley. The gold stays where it is, helping the people who've worked this land for generations. Or you find out if you hired enough guns to face an entire valley of people fighting for their homes. Kingsley's facade cracked slightly. You think these farmers scare me? I own half the territory's judges. The marshal's office looks the other. Wait, when my name comes up, I am the law out here. Maybe. Daniel stepped closer, but law doesn't make a man bulletproof. A commotion outside drew their attention. Martha Stewart strode onto the porch, her shotgun trained on Sheriff Davies. "Daniel," she called, "riders coming in from the east." Daniel allowed himself a small smile. Right on time. "What riders?" Kingsley demanded, moving to the window. His face paled as he saw the dust cloud approaching, Cal Jenkins leading a column of men, the setting sun glinting off badges. Real lawmen from 3 counties over, summoned days ago when Daniel first suspected the sheriff's betrayal. "Seems like you don't own every badge in the territory," Daniel said quietly. Kingsley's hand moved to his coat, but Daniel was faster. The pearl-handled revolver seemed to materialize in his hand. "Don't! You're not a gunman, Mr. Kingsley. You just hire them." Outside, Sarah suddenly drove her elbow into her captor's ribs, dropping and rolling as shots rang out. The valley erupted in gunfire, but not the chaotic bloodbath Kingsley had planned. Daniel's people had clear targets, clear positions, and, most importantly, a clear purpose. "Your men are hired guns," Daniel told the shaken businessman. "Mine are fighting for their homes. Makes a difference in where you aim, how steady your hand is." He nodded toward the window. "Watch." The Carson gang was falling back, their carefully planned crossfire disrupted by the positions Daniel's people had taken while all eyes were on the house. One by one, hired killers faced a choice between a payday and their lives. More and more chose to run. "It's over, Mr. Kingsley," Daniel said. "Question is, how many more people have to die for your gold?" Kingsley stared out at his crumbling plan, his face a mask of fury. "You're just like your father, a fool who doesn't understand progress. That gold could build cities. This valley already has everything it needs. Daniel's voice hardened. It has people willing to fight for it. A shot rang out. Sheriff. Davies making one last try. But Martha's shotgun roared in answer, and the corrupt lawman fell, his last betrayal ending in the dust of the land he'd helped steal 15 years ago. Sarah broke free in the confusion, running toward the house. Daniel kept his gun trained on Kingsley, but his eyes were on her, watching her move through the chaos with the grace that had first caught his attention months ago. "Make your choice," Daniel told Kingsley. "Jail or a long ride east. Either way, Shadow Creek stays where it is." In the end, Richard Kingsley III chose to live. Perhaps he saw it in the eyes of the ranchers and townspeople, the unshakable resolve of those fighting for something bigger than gold. Or perhaps he simply counted the odds and found them wanting. As the real lawman took charge of the scene, Daniel finally lowered his father's gun. Sarah reached him, her hands finding his, her eyes saying everything words couldn't. "You did it," she whispered. "We did it," he corrected, looking out at the valley that had become his home. "All of us together." The sun set on Shadow Creek, painting the sky in colors no gold could match. And in the ruins of Thunder McKenna's last stand, his son had proven that the greatest legacy isn't in how you die, but in how you choose to live, and who you choose to live for. Night fell over Shadow Creek like a velvet curtain, bringing with it an uneasy quiet. The Carson gang had retreated to their camp after the afternoon's confrontation, but Luke Carson wasn't finished. Rage and wounded pride drove him to rally. His remaining men, 15 of the hardest cases in the territory, all of them knowing that running wasn't an option anymore. "Kingsley's finished," Carson spat, pacing before the campfire. "But that don't mean we can't earn our pay. McKenna's people will be celebrating, getting soft. Time we show them what real killers can do." In the darkness, they didn't notice the silent figures moving through the trees around their camp. Daniel had anticipated this, known that cornered rats would strike hardest. He'd positioned his best marksman in a wide circle, waiting for his signal. Sarah crouched beside him behind a fallen log, her breath visible in the cold night air. "They're planning something stupid," she whispered. "They always do," Daniel replied softly, watching Carson gesture to his men. "Pride makes people predictable. Pa taught me that." Through his spyglass, Daniel could read Carson's intentions in his movements. The gang leader was organizing his men for a night raid, planning to hit the ranch when they'd be least expected. But Daniel had another idea. A owl's call cut through the darkness, Tom Wesley's signal that everyone was in position. Daniel touched Sarah's hand once, then raised his father's pearl-handled revolver to the sky. One shot rang out, then another, then a third. The effect was immediate. Carson's men scrambled for cover, but found themselves caught in a crossfire of warning shots. Voices called out from the darkness, seemingly from all directions. "Drop your guns," Daniel's voice carried across the camp. "You're surrounded." "Like hell we are," Carson shouted back, firing blindly into the night. "Come out and fight, McKenna." "Look at your fire," Daniel called calmly. "See how it shows us exactly where you are? While we're in the dark?" As if to demonstrate, shots kicked up dirt around Carson's feet, making him dance. One by one, Daniel's people called out their positions, their voices creating a web of sound that revealed just how completely the gang was trapped. It was psychological warfare at its finest, the kind of strategy Jake McKenna had taught his son for dealing with superior numbers. "Last chance, Carson," Daniel announced. "Surrender, or the next shots won't be warnings." In the firelight, they could see Carson's face contort with rage and fear. He raised his gun, aiming roughly at Daniel's voice. "I ain't surrendering to no ghost son." The shot that followed wasn't from Carson's gun. Daniel's draw was invisible in the darkness, but the result was clear. Carson's weapon went spinning into the fire, his hand bleeding. "That's 2 hands I've shot guns out of," Daniel said, stepping into the firelight. "Third time won't be so gentle." Carson's men looked at their leader, then at the darkness surrounding them, where 24 rifles waited. One by one, they dropped their weapons. Even hardened killers knew when the odds were insurmountable. Sarah emerged from the shadows. Her own gun trained steady. "Tie them up," she ordered the ranchers, who now moved in from their positions. The marshal's men will want to have a long talk with them about some unsolved murders in the territory. As their prisoners were secured, Daniel approached Carson, who sat nursing his wounded hand. 15 years ago, men like you killed my father. Thought having more guns made you strong." He knelt down to look Carson in the eye. "But strength isn't in how many guns you hire, it's in what you're fighting for." "What difference does it make what you're fighting for?" Carson spat. "Dead is dead." "The difference," Sarah said, coming to stand beside Daniel, "is that people fighting for a home don't break. People fighting for pay do." The night wore on as the prisoners were processed, their guns collected, their futures now measured in prison terms rather than blood money. Daniel watched it all from the edge of the camp, his father's gun holstered but ready. "Your father would be proud," Sarah said softly, touching his arm. "Not just of how you fight, but of how you lead." Daniel looked at her, then at the valley, stretching out below them. Somewhere out there was Shadow Creek, its gold still safely hidden, its secret now protected by an entire community rather than a single gunslinger. "Pa died trying to protect all this alone," he said. "But he made sure I'd live to protect it a better way." He took Sarah's hand, feeling the strength in her grip. Together, the stars wheeled overhead as the night deepened, their light touching the pearl handle of a gun that had passed from father to son. But unlike 15 years ago, that gun now stood for something more than one man's stand against darkness. It had become a symbol of a community's resolve, of a love worth fighting for, and of a legacy reborn in the hands of a son who'd learned that the greatest battles are never won alone. Dawn painted the sky in shades of blood when the Reeves brothers made their move. They'd slipped away during the night's chaos, and now they brought their own brand of vengeance to Broken Spoke Ranch. 6 riders, the worst killers from El Paso, to Dodge City, led by 2 men whose reputation for cruelty had made even Luke Carson nervous. Daniel stood on the ranch house porch, watching them approach. Behind him, Martha chambered around in her shotgun, while Sarah positioned herself at an upstairs window, rifle ready. "Jim Reeves!" Daniel called out as the riders drew near. "Your reputation rides ahead of you." The older Reeves brother reined his horse to a stop, his scarred face twisted in a cruel smile. "Kind of you to notice. Heard you've been making trouble for our employers." "Former employers," Daniel corrected. "Kingsley's in custody. Carson's gang is done." "That's so?" Jim's younger brother, Tom, spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Way we see it, job's still open. 5,000 in gold for the McKenna boy's head. Double if we burn this ranch to the ground." Daniel's hand rested near his father's gun. "Last chance to ride away." "Funny." Jim drew his rifle with casual grace. "Was about to say the same to you." The first shot came from Tom, aimed at the upstairs window where Sarah's rifle barrel glinted. But Daniel was already moving, his draw as fast as summer lightning. Thunder rolled from his gun as Tom's rifle went spinning away. All hell broke loose. The Reeves gang opened fire, bullets splintering wood and shattering windows. Martha's shotgun roared in answer, dropping one rider from his saddle. Sarah's rifle cracked repeatedly from above, keeping the outlaws from getting a clean shot at the house. But Jim Reeves hadn't earned his reputation by being predictable. While his men engaged the house, he and Tom circled wide, looking for another angle of attack. They found it at the barn, where they could work their way behind the defenders. Daniel saw their plan too late. Sarah, the barn. Fire bloomed in the early morning light as the Reeves brothers set the barn ablaze. Smoke began to curl into the sky, thick and black, a signal visible for miles. Inside the barn, horses screamed. In panic, "Keep them pinned down!" Daniel shouted to Martha and Sarah. He vaulted the porch railing, his father's gun spinning in his hand as he ran for the barn. 3 quick shots dropped 2 more of the gang's riders, leaving only the brothers and one last gunman. Jim Reeves emerged from the smoke like a demon, firing as he came. Daniel dove and rolled, coming up shooting. Their guns spoke almost simultaneously, and both men jerked from the impact. Daniel felt fire along his ribs where a bullet had grazed him. Jim's hat went flying, a neat hole punched through its crown. "Fast," Jim acknowledged, blood trickling from a scratch on his scalp, "like your father." But he died anyway. "Different time," Daniel answered, keeping his gun trained steady despite the pain in his side. "Different man." Tom Reeves tried to circle behind while his brother talked, but a shot from Sarah's rifle sent him scrambling for cover. The remaining gang member broke and ran, deciding 5,000 in gold wasn't worth his life. The barn's flames reached higher, casting everything in hellish light. In that glow, Daniel faced the infamous Reeves brothers, 2 against 1, just as they liked it. But something was different this time. Their usual confidence had cracked, replaced by a growing uncertainty as they realized their reputation meant nothing to this quiet young man with thunder in his hands. "Last chance," Daniel offered again, his voice carrying over the fire's roar. "Prison's better than dying." Jim's answer was another shot, but his famous aim was off. Fear had finally found him, and it showed in his trembling hand. Daniel's return. Fire took him in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Tom screamed in rage, charging forward with both guns blazing. But Daniel had learned from his father's lessons, from years of practice, and from the love of people worth protecting. His shots were precise, devastating. Tom's guns flew from his hands, and he collapsed beside his brother, cursing through bloodied lips. As the sun climbed higher, Martha and Sarah emerged from the house, guns still ready. Around them, ranch. Hands worked to control the barn fire, saving what they could. In the distance, riders were approaching, Tom Wesley and others, drawn by the smoke signal. Daniel stood over the Reeves brothers, his father's gun still smoking. 15 years ago, men like you killed my father, thought having more guns made you invincible." He looked at Sarah, then back at the fallen killers. "But I learned something you never did. The fastest gun means nothing without something worth fighting for." The thunder of approaching hooves grew louder as help arrived, but the real thunder had already rolled through Shadow Creek, echoing not just from a gun, but from the heart of a man who'd found his own way to carry his father's legacy. The late morning sun cast long shadows across Broken Spoke Ranch as the territorial marshal's men loaded the Reeves brothers into a prison wagon. Daniel watched from the charred remains of the barn, his father's pearl-handled revolver holstered. But close, the morning's violence had left its mark. Bandages wrapped his ribs, and smoke still curled from the barn's blackened beams. Sarah approached, carrying fresh bandages. "Tom Wesley's riders found something interesting at Shadow Creek," she said, beginning to dress his wound. "Seems the Carson gang left in such a hurry, they abandoned Kingsley's strongbox. Letters inside prove everything. The murder of your parents, the sheriff's corruption, all of it. Evidence for the trial?" Daniel nodded, but his eyes were on the horizon, where dust clouds marked more riders approaching. "We're not finished yet." The riders emerged from the heat haze. Richard, Kingsley Jr., the patriarch himself, flanked by a dozen armed men. They'd come from the territorial capital the moment word reached them of their son's arrest. The old man's face was granite hard as he reined his horse to a stop before the ranch house. "McKenna," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of money and influence. "Let's talk business." Daniel stepped forward, aware of Sarah and Martha taking positions on either side of him. The ranch hands and local farmers who'd stayed to help rebuild the barn spread out in a loose semicircle, rifles casual but ready. "Nothing to talk about," Daniel replied. "Your son's headed for trial. The gold stays where it is." "Everything has a price, boy." Kingsley gestured to one of his men, who opened a saddlebag heavy with gold coins. "Name yours. This feud's gone on long enough." "Feud?" Martha's voice cracked like a whip. "You murdered my friends, tried to steal our land, and you call it a feud?" Kingsley's eyes narrowed. "The territory's changing, Mrs. Stewart. Progress can't be stopped. That gold could build railways, cities." "Could build graves, you mean?" Daniel cut in. "Like my father's, like my mother's." His hand rested on his gun. "Progress isn't about what you can take. It's about what you can build together." "Pretty words," Kingsley sneered. "But I own half the judges in the territory. My son will never see the inside of a prison cell. The gold will be mine eventually." "No." Daniel's voice was quiet but carried across the yard. "It won't." Sarah stepped forward, holding up papers from Kingsley's strongbox. "These letters go to every newspaper from here to St. Louis if anything happens to Richard III. Your own words. Mr. Kingsley, ordering my father's death, Jake McKenna's murder, everything." The old man's face went pale, then red with fury. His hand moved toward his coat, but Daniel's draw was faster than thought. The pearl-handled revolver seemed to materialize. "In his hand. Like father, like son," Daniel said softly. "Both of you reaching for guns when words fail. But see, that's the difference between us. I don't draw first, I just draw fastest." Kingsley's men shifted uneasily, looking at their employer, then at the array of weapons pointed their way. They were hired guns, not true believers. The odds didn't look good. "Last chance," Daniel continued. "Ride away. Take your son's confession. Keep your reputation. Live with what's left of your fortune. Or draw and find out if you hired enough guns to face an entire valley." The moment stretched like heated glass. Then Kingsley sagged in his saddle, suddenly, looking every one of his 60 years. "You're more like your father than you know, boy. He made the same offer 15 years ago." "I know," Daniel nodded, "but the difference is I'm not alone." The old man looked around at the united front before him. Ranchers, farmers, townspeople, all standing together. Whatever he saw in their faces made him straighten his coat and gather his reins. "The territory is changing," he said finally. Perhaps it's time we changed with it." As Kingsley and his men rode away, Sarah took Daniel's hand. "Think it's really over?" Daniel watched the dust settle, feeling the weight of his father's gun, the ache of his wounds, the strength of the community around him. "The fighting's over," he said. "The building's just beginning." Martha stepped up beside them, her shotgun lowered but ready. "Your father would be proud, Daniel, not just of how you fought, but of how you won." Thunder rumbled in the distance, a summer storm approaching, bringing rain to Shadow Creek. Daniel thought about legacy, about how his father had died protecting this land alone, and how he'd lived to protect it with others, about how some battles are won not with guns, but with unity. The valley had changed. The legend of Thunder McKenna was no longer just a story of one man's last stand. It had become something more, a testament to the strength found in standing together, in fighting not for gold or glory, but for home and family. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy a father could leave his son. The next morning dawned clear and bright over Broken Spoke Ranch. Townspeople and ranchers gathered in the yard, helping to clear the debris from yesterday's battle. The charred remains of the barn were already being torn down, with stacks of fresh lumber ready for rebuilding. Daniel stood watching the sunrise from his father's old homestead, Sarah's hand in his. The ruins that had witnessed so much bloodshed would be rebuilt too, not as a monument to violence, but as a symbol of renewal. The marshal's men just rode out, Martha said, approaching them. Kingsley's son is officially in custody, and the evidence is safe. She smiled, the weight of 15 years lifting from her shoulders. Shadow Creek's secret will stay with the families who've earned it. In the distance, the morning light caught the creek's waters, making them shimmer like the gold hidden beneath. But now that gold represented something different, not temptation or greed, but the strength of a community that had chosen to protect its own. Tom Wesley rode up, his face split with a wide grin. News from town. They're appointing a new sheriff. Reckon we all know who it should be. He looked meaningfully at Daniel. Daniel squeezed Sarah's hand, feeling the weight of his father's gun at his hip. Not a burden anymore, but a reminder of how far he'd come. Some legacies, he said quietly, are about more than just following in your father's footsteps. Sometimes they're about finding your own path. A week later, Cedar Springs held its first town meeting since the battle. The saloon was packed with ranchers and townspeople, all gathered to discuss the valley's future. Pete had hung Jake McKenna's old wanted poster behind the bar, not as a warning anymore, but as a reminder of what they'd overcome together. Daniel stood before them, his father's gun still at his hip, but now accompanied by a sheriff's badge. He'd accepted the position on one condition, that the valley's families would have a say in how justice was administered. No more lone lawmen, no more secrets kept in shadows. Things are changing, he told the crowd, his quiet voice carrying. Authority earned not just through gunfire, but through trust. This valley's always been worth fighting for. Now it's time to show it's worth building for too. Martha and Sarah sat at their usual table, sharing proud smiles as the young man who'd arrived as a fumbling ranch hand now led their community toward a future built on unity rather than fear. The setting sun cast long shadows across the small, a cemetery on the hill overlooking Shadow Creek. Daniel knelt before his parents' graves, recently marked with proper headstones after 15 years. He placed his father's pearl-handled revolver on the stone, letting the dying light catch its surface one last time. "Found my own way, Pa," he said softly. "Different from yours, but maybe that's what you wanted all along." Sarah's footsteps approached. Behind him, she carried a simple bouquet of wildflowers, which she placed beside the gun. Together they stood in the peaceful quiet, watching the valley spread out below them, a land worth protecting, not through force alone, but through the strength of united hearts. Daniel picked up his father's gun one last time, feeling its familiar weight. Tomorrow it would rest in a display case in his sheriff's office, a reminder that some legacies are meant to be honored by moving forward, not by standing still. Thunder's echo had finally found its peace, living on in the strength of a community bound together by something more precious than gold.